Hello and a very warm welcome to the latest edition of the Ponsonby and Massie podcast, and comes hot on the heels of Rachel Reeves, the first female Chancellor in the history of the UK, delivering the first Labour budget in 14 years. And with all budgets, it's a mixture of politics and economics. With this particular one, a real serious set of challenges for the new Chancellor, given that there was literally no fiscal headroom in order to deliver lots more money for public services. So we knew that if she was going to try and square the politics economics circle, she was going to have to be radical, she was going to have to be bold. People saying that this was one of the big historical budgets. And in fairness, after an hour and 20 minutes on her feet, there was a sense in which this was a budget that was heavy on a lot of headlines on tax, on spend, investment, and public expenditure going forward. So I suppose before we get into the detail, Alex, the first thing to ask is that in that difficult job that all chancellors have of squaring the politics with the economics, how did she do?
Well, you're right. That is always a challenge for any chancellor, even in happy times. And these were not the happiest of circumstances in which to be delivering a budget, let alone your first budget. And as we've said before on the podcast, in many ways, this is the sort of first real act of the new government. In certain respects, you could say this is day one of the Starmer administration for real. And I think one has to take account of the difficulty of the situation in which she found herself. She began with a fairly lengthy attack on the inheritance she received from the Conservative Party, and that is obviously politically expedient, and also sets some of the context for the broader measures taken in the budget. And I don't think she can be faulted for that, nor I think can anyone realistically be surprised that a Labour Chancellor of the Exchequer delivers, shock horror, a Labour budget. There are clear winners and clear losers in this budget. Broadly speaking, I think you could call it workerist. That is to say that those on average to below average incomes, those who care for elderly or ailing relatives, those who work in the public sector, are broadly speaking the winners from this budget. Those who work in the private sector, those who run businesses, those who make gains, who are subject to capital gains tax or inheritance tax, are the losers. But she did have an extremely difficult set of circles to square, if you like. On the one hand, you need to offer a degree of hope and optimism for a country that's been short on that in recent months and years. But you also need to make sure that the markets don't overreact or react badly to the budget, and the initial signs on that front are reasonably promising or reassuring, I think, for the government, and that reflects the amount of preparation and pitch rolling that went on before the budget. But, this is a Labour budget, so taxes are up, spending is up, borrowing is up, at least compared to previous estimates. And the difficulty for her, I suppose, is that a Labour government that has said that growth is its defining mission. Well, this budget, according to the verdict of people at the Institute for Fiscal Studies and the Office for Budgetary Responsibility, they suggest that this budget will have a negligible impact on growth by the end of this Parliament. Now, it's true that the additional investment and money borrowed for capital investment may have an impact, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years down the line. That, one has to acknowledge that. But in the medium term, this is not a budget that, at least on its initial estimates and the initial reaction and analysis of it, delivers the kind of transformational or game-changing growth that the government said was its raison d'etre.
Yeah, you described it there as workerist. I would say that this was an old Labour budget. For those of the people who were saying, well, what is Starmer? Where does he stand in terms of the political philosophies within the Labour Party? This was an old Labour budget. Harold Wilson could have been the Prime Minister. Jim Callaghan could have been the Prime Minister. Denis Healey could quite comfortably have delivered this budget. Does that make it a good budget or a bad budget? Well, I think in terms of the Labour constituency in the country, and here we deal with the politics rather than the economics, it is a budget which I think allows the government to say that the pitch that we made during the election, that we were going to do our best for working people, they can now look the country in the eye and say that they have made progress on this. One of the first things that Rachel Reeves did was to accept the peer review bodies in the public sector who were all recommending pretty significant pay increases for workers. That has been honoured. It has been honoured at a cost of billions of pounds when there is no spare money. But the political judgment of the Labour government was that in a cost of living crisis, it was right to stand by these workers. And indeed, I believe that on that they made the right decision. On the national minimum wage, which of course was introduced by Labour in 1999, that's going up for workers by, I think, just over 6%. For younger workers, the increase is something like 16%. I think the long-term plan is that there will be one rate which will apply to all workers. And again, given the broader economic backdrop, this is absolutely significant. This is a lot of money which they have had to find. So I think that the narrative of standing on the side of workers, beside workers, is one which they can now start to argue and point to concrete decisions which they have made in government. I think the sad thing was that they got themselves into a complete and utter pickle over the whole thing in relation to winter fuel payments for pensioners, because it really rather suggested that this was a government which was attacking a constituency, including many poor pensioners. Well, I think as a result of the budget today, Labour can credibly say that it is making good on some of the promises which it made to stand by working people. One of the other things which they said during the course of the campaign is that there would be no return to austerity. Now, the Institute for Fiscal Studies and I listened to the guru himself, Paul Johnson, say, and by this we mean that public expenditure is not being cut in real terms going forward, that the government can probably claim in the next 2 years, that there is no return to austerity. The problem becomes if you do not get economic growth as the parliament goes on, do you go back to increase taxes yet further? There's a big question for years 3, 4, and 5. So I think in terms of the holding a line on austerity, they can hold a line over the course of the next 2 years. The increases in expenditure for the health service are not insignificant at over 22 billion over the course of the next couple of years, and that will have Barnett consequentials, which we'll come on to discuss in a moment. But of course, the big headline in terms of taxation is the 25 billion, which is going to be levied on business in terms of increases in national insurance, where the headline rate of national insurance is up, and the level at which businesses will have to pay national insurance, that has been cut. So, I mean, in short, what do we have here? We've got a government which can now say, here are measures which we are taking for working people, as we promised during the course of the election campaign. And I suppose when it comes to Conservative budgets, Conservatives are always more likely to be slightly more sympathetic to capital than Labour. Labour chancellors, surprise, surprise, are always more aligned to the forces of Labour than the forces of capital. I think from Labour's point of view, a good budget politically, one which I think economically they can in the circumstances justify. But your very last comment, Alex, is actually the real one. If they cannot deliver an economic growth in years 3, 4, or 5, this all begins to look very problematic.
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, there was also on the politics of it, at the end of Rachel Reeves's budget speech and so on, there was a return to, if you like, the sort of classic Gordon Brown dividing lines. Members opposite may object to the measures in this budget. Okay, that's their right. But they should tell me what they would cut. It's a way of putting the opposition on the sort of uncomfortable side of the fence. There were aspects of the budget I think that were perfectly reasonable. There were the increases to capital gains, reforms to the carried interest provisions that benefit private equity in particular. All of those are reasonable, but also less dramatic, less severe than had been advertised or suggested prior to the budget. Some of the changes to inheritance tax, the significant one there is probably bringing in pension pots into the inheritance tax umbrella, if you like, or beneath the inheritance tax umbrella. And then the more controversially, I would suggest, suggesting that agricultural holdings worth more than £1 million should be subject to inheritance tax. Now, what that means in effect is that an awful lot of law firms around Britain are going to do very, very well setting up trusts for small and medium-sized farmers to avoid these provisions because for example, a 300-acre mixed arable farm outside Fraserburgh currently has a market value of around £2 million. Now, that would attract an inheritance bill of £200,000 under the Chancellor's proposal. So, there are real questions, I think, for the agricultural sector there. But you're right. The big tax move was obviously on national insurance and employers' national insurance. And here again, we have something that is perhaps politically advantageous for the Chancellor because it's a tax paid by business owners and employers rather than by workers themselves directly. But as Paul Johnson of the Institute for Fiscal Studies estimates, he thinks that around 3/4 of that increase in tax will eventually filter through the system and be paid for by lower wages for private sector workers. And here again, we have this distinction between public sector workers who are protected against these tax increases and private sector workers who are not. And you have, again, this fundamental problem that faces all governments, and it's not just Rachel Reeves and it's not just Labour governments that have to wrestle with this. But for instance, when they put up tax on tobacco, they do so on the grounds that increasing taxation on tobacco will make smoking less attractive. It will put people off from smoking. By the same logic, therefore, if you make it more expensive to hire people to grow your business, are you not therefore making it less likely that businesses will hire more people and that they will grow their businesses? And are you not therefore choking off, at least to some extent, some of the economic growth upon which your overall calculations, your overall political and economic program depends?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the OBR forecasts for economic growth, we're talking in terms of 1.6% this year, 2% next year. The good news is that the economy is growing. The bad news for the Chancellor is that it's probably not going to grow enough in order to give her more fiscal headroom in years 3, 4 and 5. On the national insurance changes, I think just to tease them out a little further, of course it is the case that this will be an enormous challenge for small and medium-sized firms. There's no question about that. I think it is reasonable to assume, particularly in areas like hospitality, where you may well have small family firms, that this kind of change is the change which pushes them over the edge, which simply doesn't make the enterprise economically worthwhile at all. So there will be a downsize for many businesses who will simply not be able to bear the burden. But of course, for larger employers and employers who have economies of scale, they may well and probably will be able to absorb that, although they will not like it. It all, of course, depends on do you sign up for the direction of travel that the Chancellor has outlined in the budget today? That is to help protect working people, to try and put more money into public services, to try and kickstart growth in order that there's some light at the end of the tunnel. I'm incredibly impressed, incidentally, by your knowledge about the value of arable farms in Fraserburgh. I'm out of this conversation. I have no knowledge in that whatsoever. Yeah, there's a lot. I think the one sense in which we should sort of both be hold back in being too definitive, of course, is that the OBR reports are a couple of 100 pages. Haven't read them. The IFS will do long briefings tomorrow morning. And of course, the initial reaction which you have to a budget may well look a lot different by this time tomorrow afternoon. So I suppose talking more about the politics than the economics. But of course, there are consequentials. There are Barnett consequentials, which I think the government say amount to £3.6 billion as a consequence of the spending decisions today. I think the suggestion is that that will release about £1.5 billion for the Scottish government this year alone. Now, you're going to get a situation where the SNP will criticise no matter what the level of the consequentials will be, just as you get the Conservatives who criticise this budget and will always criticise the budget, because the politics of the budget is that if you're not in government, everybody thinks it's a horrendous budget. Privately, what do I think ministers will be thinking in terms of the consequentials? I think that they will be thinking that this is the upper end of what it was reasonable to expect, because we knew that she was going to have to come up with something for health in particular, but the 25 billion which she's raking in from increased national insurance, probably higher than most people thought in terms of tax rises. And of course, the flip side of the coin, 22 billion over 2 years for the health service, releasing consequentials for the Scottish bloc. And despite what the government will be saying publicly, I think ministers at Holyrood tonight will be thinking we've got a bit more room for manoeuvre than we thought we probably had this time last week.
Oh, undoubtedly. Now, of course, the SNP are not going to welcome the budget. The rules of political engagement require people to, play according to type and so on. But you're absolutely right. This is a very substantial uplift in the block grant for the Scottish government. I think next year's block grant amounts to £47.7 billion. That is, in real terms, comfortably the largest it has been in the history of devolution. And you're right that the 22 billion over 2 years announced for the NHS in England trickles down to provide at least £1 billion a year extra for the Scottish government. It doesn't have to spend that money on the NHS. In the past, it has not always spent Barnett consequentials in the areas from which they've been raised, if you like. So it's entirely within the Scottish government's gift to spend that money on welfare, for instance, if it wished to. That is its prerogative. That is the point of devolution in certain respects. However, I think there will be significant pressure on them to spend that money on the NHS, because apart from anything else in a political sense, Scottish Labour will be able to say, look, we have provided the means, the funding, the wherewithal for the Scottish government to spend more on the National Health Service, and it is not doing so. Draw your own conclusions from that. So I think they will have to. Whether they can spend it effectively, and this is something that I think is a challenge for the NHS at a UK level as well, particularly when you have a large lump sum bunged in a short period of time. So is it actually going to drive the efficiency and productivity gains that everybody sensible accepts are crucial to putting the National Health Service and indeed public sector services more generally on a kind of sustainable footing? And here, I think there are grounds for concern. In a story anticipating the budget this morning, my colleague Kieran Andrews at the Times, he noted that Scottish government sources indicated that much of the increased funding would be diverted to public sector pay increases. Now, we shall obviously have to wait and see until the Scottish Government delivers its budget in December, and Shona Robertson responds in certain respects to Rachel Reeves' budget, whether this is the case. But these early indications, and they are very early, so there is plenty of opportunity for them to change, obviously, are not necessarily, I would suggest, all that encouraging, given that public sector workers in Scotland are typically paid more than private sector workers, and that gap has been increasing, and they are also paid more than their counterparts elsewhere in the United Kingdom. So the notion that increased resources should go to increased salaries for public sector workers, I think, is something that is difficult to maintain in certain respects, and is unlikely to deliver the transformational gains in productivity and efficiencies that we agree are required. So there's a real challenge for the SNP there, because the rhetoric that comes from government ministers in London, particularly Wes Streeting, when it comes to the National Health Service, is that urgent change, structural and organisational change, and working practices change is required if we are to have an NHS worthy of the name. And Scottish Government ministers do not talk in those terms. They do not challenge public sector unions, public sector organisations into anything like the same degree their counterparts south of the border do. And hitherto, that has been a perfectly successful electoral strategy for them, it has to be said, but it hasn't delivered the gains in public sector performance that you might wish to see. And so I suppose, Bernard, the question for the Scottish Government is, will there be a change of approach? Or will it be, with just, 18 months or so to go before the next Scottish parliamentary elections, that the safer course is not to challenge the public sector, is actually to pretend that things can continue as they are, and not embrace the kind of reform? Because you have a Westminster government that obviously is looking on a sort of 4 or 5 year timescale. But because of Holyrood 2026, for both the Scottish Government, for the SNP, and for the Scottish Labour Party, the timetable is very different. We have elections in 18 months, and that does change things, doesn't it?
Yeah, and the answer to your question is that no, the government in Scotland will continue in the course that they have charted out, because any fundamental reform, and Labour's mantra is invest and reform, any reform will inevitably put you on a collision course with somebody, most likely the trade unions, and there's no chance of that happening before an election in 2026. But this reform mantra, again, was at the heart of the budget, in the sense that the Chancellor made clear that Labour will come forward with a set of proposals in the autumn to flesh out what they actually mean by reform. Because it's not just about investment, it's about reform. What does reform mean? Well, the UK government are going to tell us what it's going to mean. It was rather interesting that before Rachel Reeves stood up, I think there were 2 Scottish Labour MPs who asked questions of the Prime Minister, and it was all along the lines of, does he believe that all of the consequentials on health spending, that the SNP government at Edinburgh should pass it on to the Scottish NHS? You can already see the genesis of the Labour campaign here, because when those consequentials come through, the demand from Anas Sarwar is that every single penny of health consequentials should go in to the Scottish NHS. And if they don't, then his campaign message in 2026 is that Labour in London made additional resources available for the health service. Not only did Mr. Swinney, and not only have the SNP in 17 years not attempted to reform the health service in any meaningful way, but they haven't even spent the money in terms of pound consequentials which have flowed their way. So you can see the genesis of a very, very clear dividing line here in 2026. I mean, we'll see how this plays out, but if the report that you've just referenced from Kieran Andrews in the Times, that they're going to siphon some of the consequentials off to pay for public sector pay, then the reason that they would need to do that, and this gets back to reports which we've had within the last couple of months and the emergency statements which Shona Robertson was making to the Scottish Parliament, is that the government in the last year baked in increases in pay of 3%, and then, and in my view, quite rightly agreed to more than 3%, but it's bad politics and bad economics to do this on the hoof. You can make the case that you have to reward workers in a cost of living crisis, but to do this on the hoof with absolutely no financial planning whatsoever, and then having to come forward with emergency statements because you've been doing it on the hoof, is not good financial planning. And then to find that you've got a pot of money which comes your way as a result of decisions in the UK budget, and you allow that to bail you out from the folly of your own decision making. But one final point on public sector pay. The trade unions, I think, have done a very, very good job in getting quite a lot of extra resources for their members. That's what trade unions are there to do. They're there to fight for workers, and it's up to workers to stand up for themselves in a cost of living crisis. But the UK government and the Scottish government, and here I put them both on the same page, I think have done a good job at trying to recognise the pressures that workers have been under. In the next year, and the problem with pay increases in the last year is that it tends to set the tone for demands that will go in the following year. Given that inflation is below 2%, there is no chance, none, of either the UK government or the SNP government at Holyrood giving pay increases of 5, 6, 7% to workers in the next financial year. It simply ain't happening because the money isn't there.
Sure. I mean, I think from a Scottish point of view as well, and from the SNP Labour dynamic, one other thing to look out for as a result of this budget is the battle over energy. Rachel Reeves, she announced an extension of the oil and gas levy until 2030. And this was coupled with a scrapping, I think, of the investment allowances in the North Sea. So I suspect we will hear from a lot of energy companies that the North Sea is now uninvestable as a consequence of the changes made in this budget. That, I think, is something we will hear quite a lot from Stephen Flynn in particular about, that the Labour government in London is selling out Scotland's energy workforce, particularly in the northeast of Scotland. I think that is something that will become a dividing line between the SNP and Labour and will cause Anna Sawar some difficulties in Scotland. I think it will also, paradoxically, cause John Swinney certain difficulties as well, in as much as the Scottish government is committed to the sort of green energy revolution, while at the same time also decrying tax increases on the oil and gas industry. And I think it is possible to hold both those positions at the same time, but you have to be a very nimble jockey, shall we say, to ride both those horses concurrently. And I'm not sure, I think energy is one of these areas in Scottish politics where everybody wants to have their cake and eat it, but it does provide certain opportunities politically, I think, for the SNP as a result of the changes made in this budget.
Yeah, I'd sort of make my final contribution, a couple of thoughts on issues that we haven't discussed. It is, of course, in terms of modern budgets, very little comes as a surprise because everything tends to be briefed beforehand. And indeed, the stuff on the national minimum wage was briefed last evening. And indeed, some of the fiscal options which are available to a Chancellor are sometimes put there in the public domain and they're debated in newspapers. Then the Treasury will knock them down and say, no, we're not going to go near that. If you remember, there was a suggestion that they may well equalise the rates for relief on pension contributions. That was doing the rounds really for weeks and weeks and weeks before they said, absolutely not, we're not going there. The Speaker of the House of Commons sort of blew a gasket in relation to material changes to government policy. And these are material changes to government policy, which are being briefed, leaked, SPADs going into corners with journalists and saying this is what's going to happen on that front. And I'm with Mr. Speaker on this, I have to say. I'm one of these sort of rather old fuddy duds. And
no, surely not, bud. No. Don't be so down on yourself.
I worked in journalism for a year where you would have taken any leak. Of course you take any leak. But we have a parliamentary democracy, and the proper place for the announcement of fundamental changes in economic policy or any public policy is the elected parliament of the country. And by the way, the culture at Holyrood is to a certain extent the same in terms of leaks to newspapers and all the rest of it. So good on you, Mr. Speaker. Beat your chest, shout loudly, remind the executive arm of government that first and foremost they're accountable to elected members. The second thing is that you're always looking for the rabbit from the hat, which tends to be an announcement which you didn't expect. And again, today there was a lot of speculation that fuel duty was going to go up. It didn't. And the really big one going forward, and it's very, very significant, everybody simply assumed that the policy of freezing allowances which the Conservatives introduced and were due to go all the way to 2028, that she would extend this issue of fiscal drag until 2030. But it is coming to an end. A clear and unambiguous commitment to that today. Because all of these arguments about 1p on national insurance or 1p on income tax, this policy of fiscal drag in tax terms is far more profound in terms of what it does to the exchequer in terms of putting a P in national insurance or income tax or whatever. So you can say that that policy is about to be binned, and that really is rather significant and perhaps one which has gone underreported at the moment.
Absolutely, although here, as the BBC announcers used to say on the television, except for viewers in Scotland, because, of course, these questions on income tax thresholds are the prerogative or the perquisite of the Scottish Government at Holyrood. And so the freeze on income tax thresholds announced by Rachel Reeves today does not automatically apply in Scotland. But I think you're right to draw attention to that because it highlights, I think, the reality that when the rabbit in the budget is something that will not come into operation for another 3 or 4 years, then that is, if you like, as good a way of summarising the fiscal realities with which the Chancellor was grappling as anything else. Even the jam tomorrow is actually jam the day after tomorrow. But within that context, allowing for all of that, and there are significant changes in this budget, notably to the definition of public debt, which is, I think, a welcome change, actually, albeit one that doesn't create quite as much room for borrowing as some of the Labour Party's supporters would have liked. Business investment remains too low in the UK, and it's not clear that it will rise by as much as it needs to over the medium to long term. And again, of course, I suppose we should also conclude with a note of caution that many of the forecasts made by the OBR, by the IFS, by the Treasury itself and other parties are interesting, but the longer the forecast, the less confidence can be placed in it, because an awful lot can change, not just domestically in terms of the profile and fitness of the British economy, but internationally in terms of outside external effects that impact us here. And that is true both at a UK level and at a Scottish level. But I think we would broadly agree, I think, that as a political budget, this has probably served its purpose. It has met the challenges that the Chancellor and the Prime Minister set for themselves in terms of who it rewards, the emphasis it places on particular areas of economic activity. And it is, yes, I would say, a classic sort of soft Labour budget. That could well have been delivered by a John Smith had he ever been in a position to deliver a budget. It was not a new Labour budget, and it was certainly not a Conservative budget. But Conservatives who are bleating about the budget might do well, I think, to recall the fact that they had the opportunity to present their case to the public as recently as July, and it was a case that was rejected. You have a Labour government because the public wanted change. Whether this budget is enough on its own to deliver that change remains to be seen. But nobody, I think, can really find fault or be surprised by the fact that a new Labour government delivers a Labour budget.
Absolutely. And as I said in my first contribution, you're right. It had John Smith been Chancellor of the Exchequer. It's a budget that I could have seen John Smith deliver, Denis Healey deliver. Labour being Labour, but of course, many within the movement will be saying, okay, tick to that, but don't continue to make mistakes as you did with the winter fuel allowance. So I think that it's been a difficult first couple of months. I think the government have scored a lot of own goals. If this is day one, I think it's been a good day for the Chancellor. I thought she commanded the chamber. She's not a natural orator, as you said, and it will hearten many within, I think, the Labour Party, and it will give them something to go out and sell. But as you rightly say, Alex, who knows what will happen to all of these predictions because they can be blown off course very easily. One is reminded of the Harold Macmillan dictum, events, dear girl, I suppose we should say. Events, dear girl, events.
Yes, well, indeed. And on that note, perhaps it's right to say goodbye just now. We will be with you again shortly, but in terms of our post-budget analysis, and there'll be much more to come on the budget, obviously, in the days, weeks, and months ahead. But for the time being, that's it from us. So it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.